meditative soundscapes of Sonata paintings by Čiurlionis. This is the second part of my presentation. The first part of the presentation was made in the Institute of Lithuanian Culture. And I'm going to talk about the influence of Japanese aesthetics on Čiurlionis' works. Well, Čiurlionis describes the experience of painting Sonata paintings as situations or status or emotions that are self-reflective. There's no reason, there is no necessity, there are no egocentric donations of the West. But Čiurlionis says that it seems that the creator himself is absent, and he is writing to his wife-to-be. Everything is as usual. The sun is shining, flowers are blooming, people are talking and walking, and then all the meadows, fields, mountains, and flowers and birds, everywhere, beautiful. Me? I'm nothing. I'm just painting. So, what could you possibly say? How could you interpret this kind of description or saying? The key words are here: me, nothing. Because these words, this phrase says the most. It seems that the creator himself stops being at the center of the world, and he turns around and sees the world in a completely different light. He sees a very rich world, and it opens up an ontology which is not typical of the West, and this is what we are going to discuss in this presentation. First, we will tackle the nothingness or the definition of the emptiness as one of the most paradox phenomena, which in different cultures and contexts is interpreted in different ways. In the Western tradition, there is always a thing or object or subject in the center of the attention, not the more primordial and universal emptiness. Why is that? So we shall try to find the answer through analyzing Čiurlionis' paintings and how the idea of nothingness or emptiness is reflected in his works. And we shall try to make some comparisons. We will try to compare different approaches. Let's start with the emptiness. The notion of emptiness is very typical to Japan and China, especially in the Zen tradition. And emptiness there is superior. It has primacy over everything, and it is expressed in works of art, and not only works of art, but also in the daily life, in making the gardens, or tidying the gardens, or making compositions of flowers. Toyota Unichi has said that Japanese ikebanas disclose the differences of the Western and Oriental cultures. In the West, they concentrate on the centralized bouquet, and they try to make those bouquets colorful, big, large, and concentrated, and it has a center, it has a symmetry. Meanwhile, ikebana is very minimalistic. It seems that it has no weight even. And the symmetry is typical of the Western bouquet, but in ikebana is asymmetric, and asymmetry symbolizes a certain freedom of creation, and everything in this asymmetric culture is depicted or made or composed without by rejecting all the rules that could impose unwanted boundaries. Symmetry means duality, this idea of duality is in our subconsciousness in the West. This is not the case in Japan or other Oriental cultures. The same asymmetry also exists in Japanese gardens. In the Japanese garden, you will see the emptiness or empty spaces in the middle or in the center of the gardens. Not so in the Western gardens. And the very center is left open and empty for very consciously. You can actually even say that a space without things has superiority over thinginess. Emptiness is more superior than things. It looks at the first sight that when we are analyzing Čiurlionio's works and on the basis or trying to compare to the aesthetics of Ikebana, it seems that actually, if we apply the principles of Ikebana when analyzing Čiurlionio's works, then we start seeing them differently. We notice then that in most of his works, Čiurlionis is using the structure of a net or musical score. And if you see, if you remember the picture of a garden, it was arranged like a musical score. The sand was arranged in such a way as to give the impression of a musical score. And we start noticing then that in almost all sonatic paintings of Čiurlionis, like in Zen tradition, most of the space is allocated to emptiness or transparent objects. And here we can recall the saying by Van Gogh, who said to his brother, "The Japanese leave the center of the composition empty, and the objects in the front plane are exaggerated." And after some time, we already start seeing these paintings through the Japanese eyes, and we then feel the color in a completely different way. So, with the dominant emptiness also changes the relationship of the objects in the painting altogether, and a more powerful elements of space seems to give enough energy for liberation, at the same time allowing to connect those details and fragments in a new harmony. The solitude of an object is replaced by his harmony with the rest of the work, and the materiality of different objects loses their necessity. They lose this feature of necessity, and they just simply melt in the whole of the composition. Simplicity. In the sonatic paintings of Čiurlionis, we also see a very natural simplicity. Simplicity not like a simplicity in childish behavior. It's a different kind of simplicity that can also be compared to the simplicity of the Zen tradition, where the structural canons are rejected. Okakura Tenshin explains that Zen creations are simple, so simple that they are not seeking for artificial perfection, because that would be just too primitive. too simple. Perfection appears by rejecting aspiration to perfection. Or, in other words, the artwork are perfect in their imperfection. Simplicity basically shows a certain independence, spiritual independence and internal freedom. It signifies boldness and courage to behave not according to the rules or not according as you expected, but according to the way you feel. And Čiurlionian writes to Sophia, he says that Japanese he writes that the painters in Petersburg, in the Conservatory of Petersburg, are too excessive with their colors. It seems that they are trying to hide their and in doing so, I think. And by being excessive in color and composition, they are hiding their cowardness. And that's why he is using monochrome ink technique in some of his paintings, like in Zen creation. He uses the features of monochrome ink techniques, and he is painting with different shades of the dominant color, which are producing different effects. For example, he uses the play of shades of the same color, and it seems that the color is subtly contrasting itself. In the Sonata of the Sun, Scherzo, and also the Spring Sonata Finale, there are certain details that are highlighted by using a different color. But even though they are not painted very brightly, they are still made prominent, and they are seen and noticed. In music, if you want to highlight the sound, you make other sounds weaker. And here, again, the entire tone of the painting is subdued. Meanwhile, even the subtle color of the flags already becomes a very prominent accent that opens up an entirely different dimension of the creation. From the color viewpoint, this painting is opening the multidimensionality of reality. We can even say that the flags symbolize liberation and the momentous character of liberation. At the same time, it raises the boundaries between the spiritual path and mundane reality. In other words, the life itself becomes a spiritual road, and meditation becomes the life itself. And now let's see what meditation means in Zen tradition. In Zen tradition rejects any ritualized ceremonies, and the same does meditation. It rejects tiring, sitting. Meditation means, meditation exists when you are creating freely. And meditation can be exercised at the same time as doing any other activity, drinking tea, walking, or maybe doing your garden. And that's why in the Oriental tradition, we see people who are never static. They are doing something. They are walking, they are fishing, they are sleeping, and so on and so forth. The tradition, therefore, is not to depict the ritual, but to depict the liberation from everything, including the tradition itself. Only the consciousness remains together with its aspiration for freedom. The consciousness rejects all the rules, and only by doing so it finds itself in the world. Meditational practices actually frees the spirit, which transcends the boundaries of tradition and the universal fragment of concentration. In other words, the works of Čiurlionis encourages the spectators to self-reflection of the spectators and to concentrate on the contemplation state, self-contemplation processes. And thus the image itself is not a purpose in itself, not a final purpose. This is just it represents just a gate to a meditational world of the creation and invitation to continue meditating. So what does it mean? And where do these paths go? Coordination. Well, we can easily say that in the sonatic works of Čiurlionis, meditation is coordinated with ontologies of different worlds. What does it mean? Like in Zen tradition, here we are using the concepts of modesty and majesty. With only a few strokes, sometimes with contour lines, Čiurlionis opens up majestic scopes and panoramas. Even nearly childish simplicity and not simplicity but transparency and subtle fragility of details open up a cosmic dimension and never-ending spaces. They become here we have the primacy of cooperation and connectivity, which is expressed not as a defined object but as a process that becomes the symbol of contemplation. However, this symbolism of intensive and contrasting relationship does not create tension or power. It is not competitive or sharp, because it is depicted in very subtle way. It opens up a peculiar worldview and induces the contemplation of harmony, existential harmony of things. There is contemplation, or rather the contrast between the never-ending space and the definition and defined objects. They can actually they express, or they concentrate your attention on the idea of temporality and eternity, which are two contradicting notions. And there are more of such contrasts also in Zen, in Zen tradition. For example, a boat melts in the background of the lake, of the shores of the lake, or a bird which is sitting on a branch of a tree. And here the branch connects the sky and the earth, and it also highlights the fragility of the bird itself. Halftones, subtle halftones emphasize the elements of the object being unfinished. And by using these instruments, or by using these means, the artists, Zen artists and Čiurlionians as well, they are emphasizing the infinity and the infinity and subtleness of the surrounding world. The balance between the light and dark is used to highlight contrasting details, but they don't just draw these details from the background itself. So the emptiness in the pictures can be perceived and relieved, although this emptiness only gives a hint of the objects that might be hidden behind the emptiness. It creates the vibration that sends the message to the eternity and infinity. Well, coming back to Čiurlionian's creation, I can always we can see that he uses the horizon and the emptiness to convey that neither the movement, nor the look, nor the gaze has an end. It can never end. The infinity of the horizon, together with the details, create the effect of fragility. Čiurlionian likes to replicate different objects in different planes. It seems like these objects are getting away from us. They leaving us somewhere behind. The same principle is not at all. It is also used in Zen tradition. Čiurlionian's works are simple, but despite that, they never are bombastic, and you don't miss this bombasticity in the works, because his works are to denote the fragility of human existence. And Čiurlionian depicts the conditionality of the human place and time, and also emphasizes the changing dynamics of a scale. And he combines different scales in his paintings. For example, human is thinking about the now moment, which is perhaps related to the next day or next year, and the next thought can even take you over to the next generation or age. So the different scales are combined in the same background, in the same creation. And there is no feeling of uncomfort. On the contrary, This is how Čiurlionis is depicting the reality in the primordial context. In other words, while the experience of time and place is primordial in its nature. And in the West, this feeling is lost, and the people can no longer coordinate or seek harmony or achieve harmony of the time and place. This uncomfort of the modern world does not exist in Čiurlionis' paintings. He, on the contrary, is going back to the primordial meanings of time and place, and he also, by his paintings, encourages to meditate further. And at the time when in the West, was, or rather, the fragmenting trends came into being in the West, in Čiurlionis' creation, the connectivity and coordination aspects are highlighted. He is talking about worldwide harmony. And it should also be said that this notion of harmony is familiar to Lithuanians, especially in the polyphonic songs of folk songs. And we can even say that in the visual space of Čiurlionis' paintings, he is applying those inherent skills of polyphony that exist in the Lithuanian folk culture. And he used this inherent experience in composing and adapting Lithuanian folk songs to certain piano pieces and pieces for orchestra. So when we talk about the notion of harmony, it's not only connects ontologies of different worlds, but it also emphasizes that we can always seek for higher balance. And this tradition of seeking to create the balance is endless. While the seeking for harmony itself is making you to stick to better moral standards. Čiurlionis' sonatic paintings opens up a different or additional dimension of this harmony. It opens up metaphysic dimensions that allow to develop and educate sensitivity, which is not so important or articulated in the Western culture. So, in summary, the sonatic paintings of Čiurlionis talks about the spiritual well-being of a modern world, which is changing in the Western civilization. With a modern man feels free, but he is overwhelmed by different canons, rules, and standards. And a modern world feels like a small child, on the other hand, who can reject all the rules and to start exploring the world again. Together with pan-musicalism, Orientalism, and other novelties of the epoch, Čiurlionis in his creatings is very independent. We can feel an independent line in his creation, and this independence is very much related to meditational cosmologies. Yeah. we can even say that he is creating a mythical iconography of spiritual world. The cultural symbols of the old civilization is used here as new material, and it is depicted or conveyed by the artist using different painting techniques and principles, which are reflecting both Western and Oriental traditions. He is resorting to the symbols of mythical consciousness, such as road, top of the mountain, sky, earth, water, air, and other. He recreates mythical symbols that are not only related to universal cultural values, but also to the natural commonness between the man, nature, and cosmos. Harmony with the nature is important for renewing the spiritual tradition of the West. And in the sonatic creations of Čiurlionis, he doesn't reject the spiritual foundations of the West, but he rather tries to restore them in the existential way. He tries to communicate his internal world, and it can even be called a mythical communication, which is capable of shaping the most important fundamental values of spiritual world, such as morale, respect, and other. Čiurlionis is very generous, and he tries to share the images of his internal world. He shares his insights, and by doing so, he encourages to continue sharing others. Thank you.
Jeigu turim kažkokių klausimų.
So if there are any questions, I am ready to take them. Thank you very much. No doubt this is most of the best presentations together with Naglis, Yumiko, and our colleagues from China. I was very much surprised by the sensitivity of the way this material was presented. And the material itself is very interesting because it reveals how Čiurlionis was different from other artists who were under the influence of Oriental and Western cultures. While I was listening to the presentation, I kept thinking that, of course, you are localizing the Zen tradition, but I could always feel a much deeper layer of a Chinese tradition, and I thought that this should be mentioned in the text, because for Čiurlionis, because Čiurlionis admired the late Sun epoch, Mochi, and other Chinese epochs. He admired the Chinese spirit, and intuitively he felt very close to this tradition. So, may I ask you, you have made a very subtle analysis of the topic, but if you should have to summarize and to name the hierarchy of categories that you have just described, so what would be that hierarchy? What would be the hierarchy of Zen and Chen traditions in Čiurlionis creation? Which do you think would be the most important for Čiurlionis paintings? And once again, thank you very much for your presentation, which is very good. Okay, well, regarding Chen, I was using Chen as a generalization of the two traditions. And obviously, of course, Japanism has peculiar features, but of course, I agree that nevertheless, the Čiurlionis was mostly impacted by the Chinese tradition, Chen tradition. As to the categories and hierarchies, well, I started with the notion of emptiness, and I do believe that emptiness is very important in Čiurlionis' works. If we don't recognize that, we will miss a lot of things. And like Julius correctly noticed, this dragon exists in the emptiness, and emptiness has a meaning of its own. So, also, asymmetry is a very important notion or principle, and then would go, and then the simplicity and organic nature, because being natural is also very important in Zen and Chen traditions. Well, there are many scholars who say that it is too complicated to try to hide the essence of the creator or the internal potential of the creator. And last but not least, this coordination or harmonization, putting into harmony aspect. I try to reveal or describe this aspect through the combination of majesty and modesty, which implies that even if you're drawing very simple things, like in the finale, and I don't think there is any painting by Čiurlionis who cannot be characterized by this modesty and majesty, because he uses very simple strokes of the brush to depict very simple, modest things, and this connection or relationship with the space in his paintings is very, very subtle. The paintings feel like a comfortable place to be, with never-ending shores and spaces. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I thank the speaker as well as the organizers of the conference, because I'm really fascinated by this conference. It is very interesting. I came here for a very short time, but to a certain extent, I'm always here. Every talk, every discussion is an opportunity to hear about something that was not present, or maybe was present but not recognized. Well, I don't have any questions to the speakers, but I'm a question myself. I can only share my thoughts with you. The heritage of Čiurlionis is a phenomena on its own, but it's also a part of a universal phenomena, which is called the universe or a human being, the phenomena of a human being. And who is human? How humans are different from bugs or insects? when the humans disappear, only bugs will remain, but the human still exists. So therefore we are talking about interesting things, such as the text of Čiurlionis and the paintings and everything that he paints or writes are messages that he is sending to us. A method of searching, or maybe a method even of saying about his presence. And Čiurlionis tells a story about himself and the world in very simple terms. There were some quotations and citations of his from his letters. I know some of them I know by heart, but every time I hear them, they reveal new pieces of information. There was a fragment from his letter to Sophia when he is painting, but still at the same time he is observing the world around him. And he says, life goes on, people are walking, the flowers are blooming, and me, I'm nothing. Me, nothing. I'm just painting. So we should not forget that he had a very, very subtle sense of humor. And what he says does not necessarily mean that he thinks that. So he may have represented himself from the point of view of outsider, how the outsider would be looking at him. And maybe for some people it's nothing, but for him this is important because he's sharing his thoughts with his beloved woman. And by saying, I'm doing nothing, he tries to say that everything that goes on around him is nothing, but what he does is important. What he does is everything. So he made his presence known by his works, by simple words. When he writes to his fiancée and invites her to listen to silence, which is the song of the new language. Listening to the silence is a very serious thing. You can hear lots in silence. But in order to do that, you must want to listen to silence. You must be interested in silence, which is looking at you and telling things that you wouldn't even think of. Silence has eyes that are gazing at you and telling you stories. There is another thing that was mentioned. The emptiness in paintings. For some, it may look that Čiurlionis just fails to fill the spaces in the paintings, but this is a wrong impression, because he makes a point by leaving a meaningful space empty. Now, I'm about to finish another book, another compilation of my articles about Čiurlionis. It may be published this year already, and to a certain extent this book continues a previous publication, The Little Čiurlioniana. Now this book is called The Abode of the Cloud, and this book has an illustration which depicts only a contour of a boat in the emptiness, and it's in that boat there is a shape or a figure of somebody sitting there, and we don't know where the boat is going. We don't know the space where this boat is located, and who knows, maybe the boat itself knows where it is going, or maybe a human being just took a pencil, he drew a line, and he knew what message he wanted to convey. And by talking about himself, he talks about every one of us. Yeah, there is a lot of emptiness there, yes, but this is not emptiness. This is infinity, which makes a part of every one of us. And Čiurlionis even told to Sophia, we are the infinity. You are infinity, and I am infinity. And in those simple games, in flirting or making jokes with someone who is close to your heart, you are saying things that basically translate into conversation with yourself. A person who feels he is present but doesn't make it prominent. He makes a joke about his presence, but this joke tells a lot, just like Čiurlionis' paintings, which seemingly don't depict much, but indeed contain a lot of messages. Every touch, every dot, every line that you make with your pencil is meaningful. And this cloud with a boat in the never-ending space tells everything. It is a message. In the literature by Čiurlionis, there is a series of letters to Tetrakėlis, and after some stories, he just stopped writing, then started drawing, and never continued those letters again. He never came back. Perhaps he just didn't feel the need for that, or maybe he knew what is going to happen next, and it was not important for him. And who said that you have to write everything down in order to leave this as heritage for people who are now walking and talking and maybe caring about other things? Well, me, I'm only painting, he said. I exchanged some letters with Leonas Urbanas, an artist who lives in Australia. And he left some very meaningful letters. One of them was published in Kultūros Barai, a cultural journal of Lithuania. And there, Urbanas talks about Čiurlionis and about everything else, of course. And he talks about Čiurlionis by analyzing Andante of Sonata of the Spring. And he used this as an illustration to show who we are, who Čiurlionis is. And we are those small windmills standing on those hills and turning our wings. We are the small people, like those small people who live, who do something, and me, I'm nothing. I only see all these people, I understand them. But the big windmill, the presence of which is felt only through the presence of the wings, is a symbol of the eternity, and that there could be so many more of the windmills. And Urbanas says that this big windmill is Čiurlionis himself, and we are just small windmills on the tops of the hills. We're turning our blades, we're turning our wings, and that's it. Meanwhile, Čiurlionis is somewhere else, and he can see us from above, from a different perspective. He sends a message of eternity, and to convey the message of eternity doesn't take much. The last letter to Darakelis finishes with two words: you know. And then the endless contents afterwards. You know. There's you know, because you know, I have nothing else to say. And there's not even a full stop at the end of the sentence. And therefore, this literature, his poetry, is very modern. Two words, and that's it. Not even a full stop, that's it. The thought is endless. You know, what else to be said? So these are the spaces that we are talking about. The emptiness in Čiurlionis' paintings are endless. They are eternal. They are infinite. So once again, this conference is a reminder. We already knew this, but we heard it once again. Thank you very much for such a insightful comments. And I hope that next year we will be able to invite you to be a speaker at our conference.
Dėkui. Dėkui, kolegai.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague. There is a difference between eternity, or what the Greeks called aperon, which is limitlessness or boundless. And I think that here Čiurlionis was playing with boundlessness, and the farther you go, the more spaces open up, and you never know when there is going to be an end, and you're never going to reach the end, but nevertheless you can go further, one step further. We already heard the speakers talking about Zen and Tao and about the nothingness. One thing about Zen and Tao is that none of these talk about eternity, but they always tell about the journey, the path. Tao, it's a path, it's your journey. And we didn't talk about this windmill. Well, in Tao's experience, a person is born, has some presence, and then disappears again. So everything is simple. And just as the Taoists say, whenever they are burying their people, they are not crying. And when asked why they don't do that, well, and they simply say in comments, a person was born, he or she lived his life, is now dead, and is going to be dispersed. And the windmill is not only standing, it is radiating the light into the eternity. And this is a movement. You have a sheet, and you simply, with a very simple stroke, you paint. Even even though everything may seem steady, it has been also written in the motions by Čiurlionis. And he was showing that we can go one step further and we can see 1 mile further, and there is never going to be the final stop. The whole life doesn't have the final stop. By our gestures, we open up as much space as we can, and we carry on walking, and others follow. And you will never reach the eternity. It is limitless. Every single landscape says there is more to come, and there is more to travel. This is your journey, your path. I know that a path is a universal metaphor in all metaphors. The way, Tao, on the way. A way is the truth, and therefore there is a person is walking along his or her way or path, and this motion, and you see this coast, it is moving. It is not stable. Stability doesn't mean that something is stagnant. Stability means a motion in focus. So what I noted, there is a very powerful movement in this painting, and this is focused movement. Thank you.
Labai ačiū Žilvinai.